Hi, I'm Danny, and in this video I'll explain some things about putting together the Pnina pajama set by F4U. I'm briefly showing you my setup mainly to show that you don't need to be a professional sewist to still make use of some of the tools available for sewing. You can see here my projector, and it's projecting onto tracing paper at the one end and onto fabric at the other end. Most people with a projector also use cutting mats and rotary cutters. At the moment I don't. I haven't been sewing massively long, and I started with this because I got really tired of taping patterns together. So at the moment this works for me, and I either draw onto the fabric, or if it's a pattern I know I'm going to use more often, I draw it on tracing paper and then I can reuse it more easily. But just to show you what some of the tools available, even if you're not a professional. So next I've cut out all my pattern pieces, and I just wanted to remind you, make sure that you transfer your markings from the pattern, whether that's paper pattern or a projector pattern, to your fabric. So you see I've added the markings for the front and back sleeves. I've indicated with the legs which one's the front and the back, with the sleeves themselves. I've also indicated the back, the top of the shoulder, and the front of the sleeve, and that is so that you can easily match up different pattern pieces when it comes to constructing the whole. I've sewn up the bands in advance, as I'm using a different thread colour for them compared to the rest of the pyjamas. I've followed step 1 and 2, so here you see the front and back borders and the sleeves attached. So I'll share a hack with you. I've sewn up my borders, and I've sewn up the sleeves to the borders, the front and the back borders. And now I need to match up the seams. What I do is I use Wonder Tape. This you have them in many branded and brandless equivalents, and it's washable double-sided tape. So I've taped, I put a small bit of tape on the seam. You can then remove the top layer of that, and then when you fold over the other half of the sleeve, you can match the seam exactly. Then after that you clip or pin as usual, and you sew, and in that way you get very neatly matched seams without having to worry about your fabric moving while you're sewing. And here you can see the result: perfectly matched seams in both directions. I'm now attaching the cuffs, sleeve cuffs, and I've used the exact same trick. So I've used Wonder Tape to match up my seams, both in the middle of the cuff and between the cuff and the sleeve itself. You can also see that I've put my presser foot inside the sleeve. This can be a handy trick, especially when you're sewing up smaller sizes, because then you don't have to fuss with getting the sleeve properly aligned under the presser foot. So next I'm going to attach the neckband. As you can see, I've quartered it. As you notice, I use clips rather than pins. This is mainly because I often sew in the same space where my children also play. I sew for my 2 young children, and I don't want to run the risk that they end up kind of stepping into pins or something. This is also a childhood experience, because this actually happened when my mum was sewing and me and my brother were younger. So I use clips rather than pins to avoid this risk. So I've quartered the neckband, and I'm going to do the same to the band of the t-shirt. What's important to remember when you do this is that the shoulder seams are not halfway points between the front and the back, the middle front and the middle back. So the ways to find the full quarter points is to first put the shoulder seams together, and then you find your middle front and middle back. You put clips on there or pins in there or another way of marking. Then you put those two together, and then you can find out what your exact middle of that is at the sides. And often it's a bit in front of your shoulder seam, but you won't know exactly until you figure it out this way. So put the shoulder seams together first, find your middle front and your middle back, put those together, and then find the middle sides. I've marked the middle front and middle back. And here you see all quarter points marked. So I've attached the quartered neckband to the neck that I'd also quartered. And keep in mind that you have your seam at the back of the shirt, because you'll find that at least once in your life you'll do this wrong and you'll have the seam in the front or somewhere where you don't want it. So make sure that it's at the back and attach it, and then you stretch the neckband while you attach it to the main fabric. So I've attached the neckband and trimmed the seams. I'm also adding a label, so I'm doing that before I'm top stitching my band. Top stitching is optional, but especially for neckbands, I do think it makes them sit flatter. So I generally do it for neckbands, not always for the rest. So for the waistband, I've combined the earlier tricks of using Wonder Tape to match up the seams. The thing to remember when you do this is to only use small pieces, because of course everything where you attach Wonder Tape no longer stretches. So that's something to keep in mind with stretch fabric. And I've quartered up my waistband, hip band, so I can attach it evenly, and I'm stretching it as I go. If you're cutting your waistband from the main fabric, you could theoretically also just have one seam that you have in the back, similar to your neckband. But if you're using ribbing, it's often not wide enough to limit yourself to cut it from one piece. You've now finished your F4U Pnina pajama shirt. Onto the pants. So I have all my pattern pieces for the pajama pants here, including the elastic. Before you cut the elastic, give it a few good stretches. This helps it stay in shape better afterwards, because it often stretches a bit without completely recovering the first few times it stretches. So if you don't do this, you might well find that your elastic ends up being too long after being worn a couple of times. So stretch it a few times and then cut it to size, and then follow the instructions as usual. Follow the first two steps for the pants, sew up your crotch seams and then the inner leg seam. So I'm making my pajama pants with an elastic waistband. I'm still using ribbing because I want it to be the same fabric as everything else, but I'm inserting elastic here. You can see I've overlapped my elastic as the instructions say and sewed it up. Normally I don't fasten elastic because in my experience it's usually quite okay without turning. If you are concerned about this, then in the seam at the back you can put some stitches. So slowly and carefully when you do this. Some sewing machines are not happy about sewing elastic, but mostly it shouldn't cause any difficulties. What's important, of course, when you sew is to make sure that you sew the fabric and not sew along the elastic, so that you get a casing where the elastic can move and stretch freely. Quartering up the pants is fairly easy because here the front and the back seam are the middle points. So all you need to do is mark the sides and then quarter up your waistband, which can be with the elastic in there. That can be a little bit of a fuss, but not dramatically so. And then attach it together. And then when you sew, make sure that you only sew the fabric and you don't sew the elastic to the fabric. When attaching bands or cuffs, make sure you only stretch the cuff and not the main fabric. Attach the leg cuffs in the same way as you did the wrist cuffs. Congratulations, you've now finished your F4U Pnina pajamas. Thank you for watching this construction video. Don't forget to follow F4U Patterns on social media so that you can ask questions and get updates on new patterns.